And who is my neighbor? I grew up in Plymouth, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis, about 20 miles from the city. It looks like a lot of places in the Midwestern United States, for those of you who've been there. It's flat, rolling countryside that has long been used as farmland for growing corn or wheat. My childhood neighborhood looks like a lot of middle-class neighborhoods in the area. Pleasant homes built in the last 40 or 50 years, green lawns watered by sprinklers in the summer. And if you asked me, who is your neighbor, when I was 10 years old, I would have told you about the people who lived on my block. The McLeans, with their 3 kids who grew up alongside my sister and me. The Millers, who lived across the street and who took care of their yard with religious devotion. The Hartenbergs, who were at the end of the cul-de-sac and whose screen door I accidentally broke once by running into it face first. The Muellers, whose boys ripped me off trading baseball cards when I was too young to know any better. My first understanding of the word neighbor had to do with proximity, with the people who lived on the street I did, including maybe the surrounding few blocks. Those were my neighbors. I was pretty sure about that. And I know I'm not alone in understanding it that way. The Greek word for neighbor has nearness at its root. It's about being close. But of course that raises a question. How close? Just those on my street? Are those my neighbors? What about my block or 3 blocks out? Do they still count? Where does it end? The ambiguity of the word neighbor is right there at the center of our gospel reading from Luke this morning. You all know this parable, and you know what we usually call it, the Good Samaritan. You know it's about being like the good guy in the story and not like the bad clergy. You know, but as we come to this familiar text again this morning, please notice this. This whole story gets started with a question about what being a neighbor means. I guess it technically starts a little before that. Jesus is presumably with a crowd of people, as he often was, and a lawyer stands up with a question for him. We don't have a great word in English for this man's profession. He wasn't a trial lawyer, but an expert in religious law, somebody who, like the scribes, was a keeper of the traditions of the faith. And when it says that he stood up to test Jesus, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was up to something nasty. Asking tough questions is part of what you did with a rabbi. It came with the territory. And so this question certainly is tough. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus can apparently spot a lawyer right away, so he takes him on his own terms. What is written in the law? What do you read there? He asks. And the lawyer responds right away with a direct quote from the law, from the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, to be exact. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. The man knows this stuff, and Jesus is satisfied with the response. You've given the right answer, he says. Do this and you'll live. Love God and your neighbor with every bit of your being. Sounds simple enough, right? The story could have ended there. The man gave the right answer. Jesus said as much. Now they could both go on their way, except that something was needling this lawyer. Something wasn't clear about that bit from Leviticus. Something bubbled up in him, and he asked the question that got the whole story going. And who is my neighbor? I don't know just what the neighborhood you grew up in was like. Chances are, in many ways, it was very different from mine. But maybe not in every way. Because there wasn't a whole lot of diversity on my block. Sure, there were some differences. The McLeans and the Millers went to the Catholic Church. The Versteegs hung wooden shoes outside their door as a reminder of their heritage. But nearly everybody was Christian. Everybody had a middle-class income, and everybody basically looked like me. It was pretty clear that we all came from the same group, the same tribe, you might say. We don't know exactly what was behind the lawyer's question about neighbors, but Luke tells us that he was trying to justify himself, which makes it pretty clear he was trying to figure out the limits of that term. 1 block from my house? 2 blocks? My half of the village? Who counts? Where are the boundaries? And that's what gets Jesus going on this story about a man on the road outside Jerusalem, a road frequented by Jewish people, by people of this lawyer's own neighborhood. He falls into the hands of bandits and is left by the road for dead, penniless, injured, and naked. And 2 of the people you would most expect to help, a priest and a Levite, both religious types, both part of this injured man's tribe, both the sort who would easily be natural neighbors for this man. These 2 pass by on the other side of the road. And instead, it's a Samaritan, a member of the religious minority group, who stops to help. Samaritans and Jews didn't get along. You probably know this. Nobody knows exactly how far back the mutual dislike went, but there were centuries of distrust and animosity and prejudice between these groups. You get a little glimpse of this at the end of the story when the lawyer can't even say the word. Jesus asks who was a neighbor to the man by the side of the road, and instead of saying the Samaritan, the lawyer can only respond, the one who showed him mercy. The word won't even form on his tongue. That's the kind of deep division that was crossed in this story. Go and do likewise, Jesus said. One writer has called this last week the week from hell in the United States. It's been a week where the sometimes underlying racial tensions in the country have boiled over in multiple incidents of violence. And one of those incidents took place just 20 miles from my home neighborhood, 2 miles from the seminary where I spent a year studying. Philando Castile, a 32-year-old African-American man, was pulled over by police in traffic. And while the details are still unclear, what we know is that while he was reaching for his license and registration at the request of the officer, he was shot multiple times and died shortly thereafter. What's also clear is that the incident is part of a well-established pattern in my country of African Americans being treated with disproportionate hostility and violence by the police. And I believe it comes back, in some ways, to that word, neighbor. Unless we happen to grow up in an unusually diverse environment like the one we're sitting in right now, chances are that from an earliest age, the people who first come to mind as neighbors are people who basically resemble us, who have similar backgrounds and experiences and beliefs. I don't think there's necessarily something malicious about that. It's just often the way things work. I loved those neighbors of mine growing up. They helped nurture me as I grew. But the thing is that meaning of neighbor needs to change, and it needs to grow. Because when neighbors are only those nearby, or those who look like me, horrible things can happen, especially for those who are not in power in the culture. The news from my hometown this week is evidence of that, I believe. I don't tell you this story because I think you should all be particularly concerned with the news from Minnesota, or because I think it's more important than the news from Kenya or Brazil or the Philippines. I tell you this because it's my neighborhood, and I don't know what else I could talk about with integrity today in response to the question, and who is my neighbor? More than that, I tell you this story in the hope that it might help you think about your own neighborhood, the lines that you discerned early in life, and the lines that keep on defining it for you still. How have they changed over the years? Where do they fall? Are they lines that fall because of difference in color, or economic status, or sexual orientation, or political perspective, or nationality, or religion? Where does the tribe end for you? Where does the neighborhood stop? 2 blocks, a school district, a city, a country? I know many of us are here in Geneva because in one way or another we are committed to a world where these sorts of barriers are no longer defining, where cooperation and coexistence and human rights are paramount. I believe Jesus' parable is meant to be that all-encompassing, that global. But the parable comes because one individual person trying to justify himself asked that tricky question. And who is my neighbor? One person with his own neighborhood in mind his own boundaries to tend, his own tribe to care for. Who is my neighbor, he asks. And Jesus tells him a story about an individual reaching across lines of tribe and creed and religion and prejudice to care for a fellow human being. Go and do likewise, he said. In my neighborhood, I am certain that Jesus' call to do likewise means, in part, that those like me in positions of privilege, those who've grown up in the majority culture with innumerable privileges we rarely even thought about, including that of having law enforcement on our side, those in positions like me need to confront the systems and actions that continue to perpetuate racism and injustice. I don't know exactly what go and do likewise means in your home country, in your neighborhood. I don't know exactly what it means right here in Geneva, but I know it means letting that term neighbor be redefined until our too small definitions fall away again and again, until we confront the evils that have come from caring only for those we perceive as like us, from ignoring wrongs inflicted on others, until we see that God's love means to topple every barrier, and we learn to live as though it truly is so. Because when we ask that question, and who is my neighbor, Jesus' response comes to us with surprising and utter clarity, time and time again. Every child of God. Everyone. Amen.